name's Dr. Michael Masters. I'm a professor of biological anthropology at Montana Technological University in Southwest Montana. And I became interested in the UFO phenomenon at a very young age. I heard an account that my father told about a UFO interaction he had shortly before I was born, and it really piqued my interest in this phenomenon and really got me thinking about whether or not UFOs are even real. Hearing that from someone that you know and respect is obviously going to change the way you perceive this seemingly mythical phenomenon. And not long after that, he got Whitley Strieber's book Communion. And I remember looking up and seeing that on the shelf one day, and it sort of triggered this thought in my mind: what if they're us? What if they're humans coming back through time to visit and study their own past? And there were a number of characteristics of that archetypal gray alien that really indicated that they might be. They seemingly have a similar form that links us phylogenetically, and obviously a more advanced form, both morphologically and technologically. So it made sense that they could just possibly be us. And I decided to spend some time investigating that question. My father describes an event where he was a veterinarian in Amish country in Northeast Ohio, and described coming over a hill and seeing a light in the distance, which is rare for Amish country where they don't use electricity. And all of a sudden, the light shot toward him and a colleague that was in the truck, and just sat there hovering. I think he said about 100 yards away or so, and darted back to where it was previously, hovered there for a few short minutes, and then shot straight up into the sky at tremendous speed. So it's hard to confuse that with anything ordinary, especially in that particular region where there aren't a lot of lights. So it was a pretty impactful event for him early on, and apparently impacted my course of study as well. I think his UFO encounter took place around the mid 1970s. This particular encounter that took place with him and his colleague in this rural area of Northeast Ohio was an isolated event. To my knowledge, there were no other interactions that he had. I did actually have a UFO encounter recently. People have been asking me that for years, and I never had. I'd never seen anything anomalous in the sky, but recently I did finally get to join the club, so to speak, and see something that was definitely anomalous. I couldn't find any prosaic explanation for it. Initially, I thought it was Starlink, but it became clear later on that what I saw was nothing like a Starlink satellite launch. Well, with my encounter, it was actually 5 of these objects. I was just here at my home, and I walked up the canyon a little bit and looked out over what's known as the East Ridge here in the city I live in. And there were 5 bright stationary lights hovering over the mountain. And I obviously was instantly aware of them because they were much closer and brighter than any star, and they weren't moving. So obviously it couldn't have been a plane. So I sat there and watched for, I would say, maybe 45 seconds to a minute. And then all of a sudden, from right to left, the one that was furthest to the south, they just took off along the horizon at tremendous speed, one after the other. And they were separated by, I would say, from their frame of reference, a mile or two. So they were clustered together, but definitely with some space in between. And then one by one, they just shot off at tremendous speed, moving southwest. And it was, it was pretty incredible to see. It was nighttime, so they were just really luminescent spheres, I guess, sort of the standard description that everybody else has, where it's highly illuminated. It's not really radiating light. It's just sort of a glowing disc orb. It's hard to gauge the exact shape from that distance, but it was certainly bright and capable of moving exceedingly fast. They were only stationary for I wouldn't say any more than a minute and a half. I just kind of stood there watching, aware that something was strange about these objects and these lights, but it wasn't really a very long interaction. I wouldn't even call it an interaction, more of an observation. I was simply witnessing what was a very anomalous group of lights. It was pretty late too. It was probably around 12:30 or 1 in the morning. Well, I decided to write my first book in October 2012. I'm not really sure what the exact inspiration at that moment was. I'd known I wanted to write this book for some time. And I'd been investigating this question of whether or not aliens could be future humans coming back through time. So I remember exactly where I was. I was upstairs at a music event at a local brewery. And one of my research assistants was with me. And I asked him, "Hey, do you want to help me write a book about UFOs?" And he said, "Yeah, sure." That sounds fun. So him and another research assistant, both of whom have gone on to have very successful careers in various fields, helped me early on with some of the initial research into the phenomenon and some time travel things, and just really trying to put together the ideas that about 7 years later would culminate in the publication of that book. But I think a big part of it was knowing that by the time I was done, I would have tenure, which is important, the protections that come with tenure, and also have reached full professor status. So there would be protections in place, and I wouldn't have to worry about any pushback impeding progress as far as moving forward in my own career. So I knew it would take a while, and I had a lot of other projects going on, research projects relating to biomedicine and evolutionary anatomy, neuroanatomy, paleoneurology. So it was a good way to sort of start the process, get the ball moving, but without having to just focus on that one thing. I could sort of dip in and out of it when able to. And yeah, it was kind of a long-term plan, but I don't know if there was any one thing that inspired me on that day in October 2012 to decide to do this. I think the grand message relates to how we should really be exploring other ideas. We kind of get locked into this pattern of just thinking of the phenomenon as being extraterrestrial, and it's intuitive. They seemingly come from the sky, they come from the stars, so we can understand how people would think that. But when you really start to pick it apart and look at the nuances of this phenomenon and think about a lot of issues related to a separate evolution on a different planet, with the different distance from its star, different temperature, atmosphere, climate, all kinds of things related to gravity, there's just a lot of reasons why we wouldn't expect to have upright walking bipedal hominins like ourselves evolve independently on these other planets. So that, in addition to just the similarity in the form, the similarity in the technology, how they can seemingly manipulate time and space at will, a lot of things indicate that we do have a relationship, and they're probably just a more advanced form of ourselves. To investigate this this time travel model, and the idea has been around for a long time. The 40s is the earliest incarnation I could find, but I wanted to take a multidisciplinary approach. So I really tried to bring together informations from various fields, most notably anthropology, physics, astronomy, and astrobiology, to sort of explore this question of whether they could be us in a more advanced form, technologically, morphologically. And so I think to do that, we need the combination of a lot of different views and a lot of different areas of expertise throughout the sciences. And so I was simply trying to take a multidisciplinary approach and really sort of make the case for this, or at least provide some indications to why we should be thinking about this, and not just get locked into that trap of only exploring this idea in the context of the extraterrestrial hypothesis. I think my personal education has been really impactful and tremendously helpful in that it's been grounding, for one thing. I started initially from a very materialist standpoint and really trying to identify the simplest explanation, sort of taking the parsimonious approach, Occam's razor, where It's sort of an abductive approach too, inference to the best explanation, because we can't apply the same standards of evidence and the scientific method to this particular investigation. It doesn't lend itself to that. But I think still from starting from a very grounded scientific perspective, it allows you to sort of reach into this without overstepping your bounds. So I think it's helped me remain somewhat conservative in my approach and somewhat grounded in the methodology that we use to investigate it. In my first book, I didn't look too much at the contactee abductee experience. It was mostly trying to build a case around what we know about time, what we know about time travel, what we know about human evolution and long-term trends throughout human evolution. I did tie in a couple of cases, UFO reports, did some statistical analyses, but my second book, The Extraterrestrial Model, really dove deep into abductee accounts and contactee accounts. And it was a combination of researching well-vetted reports, ones that had been investigated thoroughly, and would sort of meet the criteria set up by J. Allen Hynek for the strangeness and the reliability. But then also just from talking to people, I learned so much about it. After publishing the first book, people felt comfortable telling me their stories. So I got to know the phenomenon really well through others and people I trusted and knew well, telling me about very anomalous encounters that they've had. And I think all of that sort of came together in the publication of this book. Well, there's clearly things we don't yet know about the structure of space and time. Physicists largely agree that time is an emergent phenomenon. It comes from something more fundamental. And I think until we really fully comprehend what that is, it's going to be difficult to wrap our heads around the exact means with which these visitors are manipulating space-time. But there are a number of things, even from this vantage point, our limited primitive perspective of time, where we can see that this is happening. Hal Puthoff refers to it as manipulating the space-time metric, and others in the physics engineering community have articulated similar things. So clearly that is happening. And from these abductee accounts, you can see how there's divergent time, there's missing time. They experience time differently in and around these craft, which seems to indicate that that machine, that craft is the actual time machine. And it has the capability of bending and warping time. And if that is the case, which it seems to be, I can't think of any reason why they wouldn't use that to move through time and visit various points throughout their own evolutionary past. So I think eventually, once we figure out how to circle the square of general relativity and quantum mechanics and have a fully immersive theory of quantum gravity, we'll start to be able to unpack these things more. But there's certainly still some barriers that stand in our way as far as understanding the exact mechanism of how these visitors are doing what they're doing. Well, certainly consciousness is a big part of this, and we can time travel with our consciousness now. I think it's going to be an issue of really trying to unpack how they're doing it physically, how they're moving their physical form through space and time. Not perfectly, obviously. There's crashes that happen, and a number of very good indications that they have crashed, and we have recovered some materials associated with those. But I think there is probably an aspect of our consciousness that moves through space-time as well. I've had intense precognition my entire life, which is really just your mind time traveling through a dream state to future events, future moments that exist in the context of the block universe and are just as real as the present and the past. We just haven't experienced them with our physical brain mind interaction yet. But as far as the actual physical aspects of time travel, really once that time machine exists, it exists at all points in the human past as far back as they can reach. So it's not really even about when we invent time travel. We could time travel at any point if they decide to come back and pick us up with the machine that they've already developed at some point in the future. And then speaking of the crashes, it's possible that there's sort of a bootstrap time loop there too, where if you have a device from the future that crashes into the past, it can help in the creation of that same machine later. And there's not necessarily a creator of it, because the people that were gifted this highly advanced machine didn't make it. They reverse engineered it, figured out how it worked. People in the future didn't either, because it's the result of that. But you can have this device that always exists in the block universe, and there's no paradox there. It's just it's all highly consistent, and it's really just a self-creating infinite loop of cause and effect. I don't think it's going to be that jarring, especially if it is us. I think that would really challenge people's worldview much less than if we had to accept that there are these beings coming from other planets that have been interacting with us and doing things to us and with us for millennia. But I do think it's going to challenge people's worldview in the context of time. It's going to have to be something we talk about and think about finally. I think one of the major hangups has been that we don't, or that we come up with these stories where time isn't how it actually is in the physical universe, but we'll use it in science fiction, and we'll use it for screenplays and TV and film, just simply because it has to be something we can manipulate to make a good story. But I do think it's not going to be that difficult, and I think I get the sense that we're already moving toward that, to be honest. If you would have asked me 5 years ago how long it might be before we know about this phenomenon, or even get inklings that it is real and maybe it is us, I would have said decades. But I get the sense that maybe it's something that's already happening, and we're sort of inching toward that, what a lot of people refer to as disclosure. But I do think it's going to shake certain people. I don't think we can just say, how will this affect society? Because there's so many different factions of society and demographic groups, and people who are religious, not religious, different religions might conceptualize these things in variable ways as well. So I don't think it's going to be just one wave of understanding. I think there's going to be a lot of people who go, oh yeah, okay, and move on, and a lot who really struggle with the realization that the reality they constructed may not be as valid as they once thought. A lot of the abduction phenomenon seems to mirror what we would do as scientists, and specifically as an anthropologist. I've worked in a number of dig sites in Africa, and the United States, and France, and elsewhere, and we're left with the material remains of the past, what we dig up, what's preserved, oftentimes highly fragmented pieces of that past. So if we had the opportunity to go back in time and pick up our ancestors and examine them physically and cognitively and emotionally, it would give us a wealth of information that otherwise isn't available to us. And not just physical anthropologists like myself, but cultural anthropologists and archaeologists and linguists could learn so much more, psychologists, sociologists. So I think it's really a scientific tool. And what we're seeing is our distant descendants in some cases, and more proximate descendants in a number of cases as well, who are studying us, but also the ecology of the earth, the environment, changes in the ecology over time. And if you have access to a time machine, you can do these longitudinal studies over very long stretches of time and see how an individual changes, can see how the environment changes. And with regard to the individuals, I think it helps explain why in so many cases they describe knowing these same people throughout their lives, but those visitors never age. They look the exact same as they did when they were children. And that's something you could certainly do in the context of a long-term longitudinal study, at least in the context of the frame of reference of the child into adulthood. But these visitors could do a study like that over the course of a day or two. So I think once you interject this time variable into the phenomenon, we can see how it would be useful in doing scientific research, and not just on us, not just on humans, but on any number of life forms, and especially with regard to changes in the earth itself, ecologically and environmentally. The animal mutilations are certainly a perplexing aspect of this phenomenon. They're very common, they're ubiquitous across the planet. They do seem to be related to this in the sense that you have UFOs seen in association with these animal mutilations very commonly. I know people personally who have seen UFOs over their pasture, and the next day their cows have been subjected to the same thing. And there's yes, there's a lot of patterns to it. It's seemingly very surgical. The fact that there's no blood, that they're always taking the same parts of the animal's anatomy. All of these would seem to indicate that it is the same individuals doing this to various animals in different places. As to why, I think it's going to be some time before we understand that. Perhaps they have some use. Perhaps they have some use for the blood, maybe in their own lives or their own research. Or it's possible that they are using these tissues to study something. It could be an aspect of their scientific research. I certainly have no idea, and I don't know if anybody could really say for sure, but it's one of these things where if we investigate it and look for patterns across these events, which do happen globally and have been happening for long periods of time. I just read recently that Alexander Hamilton saw one of his cows being carried away by a UFO, and it was found 4 miles away and was cut up in the exact same way that we would eventually come to understand that they do this in association with these captures and mutilations, as they're called. So I do think it's important to investigate this. It's clearly tied to the UFO phenomenon, but as far as figuring out why exactly they're doing this, I think it's going to take some time before we can really wrap our heads around the purpose behind it, because it is seemingly quite odd. I don't really have any insightful thoughts as to why these specific parts are taken. My understanding is it's the tongue, the eyes, parts of the reproductive anatomy, parts of the gastrointestinal system, the blood's taken. No, I've mostly focused on the visitor's physiology and the craft in the context of what those may be doing. And admittedly, I haven't looked into the animal mutilations very much, or crop circles is another one that I don't really have much to contribute. Something that's certainly interesting and I think worthy of study. I just haven't gone down that rabbit hole myself. There is a lot of variation in the context of the way the beings are described, but we also see a lot of consistency in the way they're described, and specifically with regard to them being tetrapods. I haven't found an account that describes something without 4 limbs or isn't bipedal. There are certainly different variations and varieties of beings, but we do also see that there's a lot of consistency in what's described, especially if we look at the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Free study, which now has upwards of 5,000 survey respondents, contactees, and abductees from across the world. It was a multi-language study, and they found that the most commonly described form was human. And then after that, you had the short grays, the tall grays, and the hybrids. But importantly, all 4 types are hominin. They would be classified in the same way that we would as upright walking, penadactyl tetrapods, bipedal humans. So I think it is important to note the variation, but I think it's also overblown to some extent, because if you look across the literature, even outside of this free study, if you look across the literature and talk to people, they almost always describe humans or some variety of hominin that seemingly is more advanced than ourselves. I have looked into the Bigfoot encrypted thing to some extent. Again, it's not the main focus of my research into this highly variable and highly bizarre phenomenon, which I think keeps us all interested because there is so much to it. My understanding is it used to be sacrilege to associate Bigfoot with UFOs, but I think people have kind of come around to the fact that they're oftentimes seen together or in the same vicinity in short periods of time. I do think from what I've seen that we can ascribe the block universe model to most of what's taking place, and it is the most agreed upon interpretation of time in the universe and the physics and philosophy communities and elsewhere. But when you start talking about cryptids in association with these craft, you have to wonder if there could be some interdimensional aspect to that, where we're getting a glimpse of something that maybe isn't a part of this reality, or at least not a part of this time that we're associated with in the present or the recent past. So it does seem to be something that adds further mystery to an already very curious question. But yeah, I don't really have anything too insightful to say about that. It's certainly worthy of investigation, but it's not something I've spent a lot of time on. Well, yeah, I've met people who have described that same thing, where there would be sort of, I think one individual I spoke with, I can't remember if it was his account or it was someone he knew personally. So there could be an extra layer of uncertainty here, but he described the same thing, where there was sort of this weird ball of moving energy, and half like legs, half of a Sasquatch looking cryptid, which then fully materialized and it just walked off. So yeah, something like that does seem to indicate some sort of interdimensional or intertemporal thing, because we would expect to see that with movement through time as well, that you have something materialize and dematerialize. That's an aspect of time travel that you do expect to see as things move in and out of your own personal space at any given time within the block universe. So whether that's an aspect of these craft that are distorting space-time enough that you can see into other periods. I cite a case, Linda Jones, in my most recent book, where as she's moving within the sphere of influence of this craft, she's seen people in fedoras who were possibly seeing what she was seeing too, but who maybe existed in that same place 70, 80 years prior. So if they are manipulating space-time in and around these craft, you might expect to have things like that, where you get little glimpses into a different time, possibly in that same place, possibly somewhere near there, where you are seeing something that did exist in that place, but just at a time that's divergent from your own present, your own now. So if we can consider cryptids in the context of these craft, I think it might help explain some of that. But I do get the sense that it's much more complicated than that. It's something that might make sense for some cases, but if there's no craft present, how do you explain something like a cryptid that just materializes and dematerializes in front of you? I don't claim to have any answers there. I'm not sure how that would happen. It is possible that, yeah, it's not just where you have to have this machine that's manipulating space-time, but there could be something about specific areas that are anomalous. They possibly have a higher electromagnetic relationship with the Earth. There's stronger electromagnetic energy. I certainly don't know, but the fact that you do have individual places like Skinwalker Ranch and others that do have a higher frequency of anomalous events certainly might indicate that there's something going on there that's maybe associated with UFOs in some capacity, but maybe not directly caused by them, but possibly something that overlaps with the phenomenon, the UFO phenomenon in some way. And there are a lot of these, and I think there's been a lot of there's been numerous sort of I think a lot of the problem has been the stigma, where we can't really investigate these things in the way that we want to until recently, and that's starting to happen more. And the good as we begin to get more good data coming out of these places and take these things seriously and really put in the effort to try to understand what's happening, I think we might be able to start answering some of these questions. There does seem to be a strong electromagnetic presence in and around these machines. Again, how put off mentioned that there might be a blue shift happening where even the visible light spectrum gets shifted up into X-ray, possibly even gamma ray. So it could be an aspect of the manipulation of time associated with these machines. It could have something to do with the way they use energy as part of their anti-gravity propulsion system. There's a lot we don't yet understand, but you do have that described in a number of instances, especially when they power up and take off. John Keel, in his book, Operation Trojan Horse, I think it's called, describes the same thing. He even talks about where they enter and exit and how that relates to the visible light spectrum and the electromagnetic energy that comes off of these machines. So I certainly think it's important. The electromagnetic force seems to be a big part of their anti-gravity propulsion system as well, since it is 10 to the 40 times stronger than gravity. It seems that that's not just a coincidence that you have the light and the other forms of electromagnetic radiation associated with these craft, how they're able to shut down cars and radios and just cause distortions in our broadcast and receiving technologies. So yeah, I think it is something that definitely is involved and certainly something we should be studying more closely. Well, when I say entering and exiting, I'm talking about our specific position in time, our specific place that we occupy within the block universe, moving in and out, whether they're going back to their home time that they come from in the future or leaving this time to go back further into the past to study one of our collective ancestors, or even staying in this time and powering up to take off at tremendous speed and go study someone that's still a part of our position in the block universe, but is just on the other side of the globe. So yeah, I guess I'm referring to movement in four-dimensional space-time, whether it be through time or in space at the same time. I think to really fully comprehend this phenomenon, we need to get past a lot of cultural hangups, religious, political hangups that keep us from really taking it seriously and investigating it in real terms. And fortunately, that has been happening. I think a lot of us who have studied this for a long time feel encouraged by the changing culture surrounding this phenomenon and just the shift in the global zeitgeist, really. But I do think, as far as really understanding the machines themselves, I don't think we're far from that. And that may be a part of this disclosure movement, that if we are eventually going to become them, we would expect to get to the point where we can see ourselves in them, not just physically in their physical form, but in the technology that they have. It doesn't seem that different from the technologies that we have in our own capabilities. We're just a little bit off from the actual mechanisms, the engineering involved, the material science involved in being able to do this ourselves. But I think once we get close enough to understanding that connection between us and them, it's really only a matter of time before they begin to want to reveal themselves to us. Why wouldn't they? If we are related, if they are our descendants and we are their ancestors, why wouldn't they want to introduce themselves? And especially with so many of us just begging for answers about what this phenomenon is, once we get to the point where we can see how similar we are to them and they are to us, I think it's only a matter of time before they decide it's time to answer some of those questions that we're all begging to have answers to. This has always been a collective effort. There's so many people that are taking it seriously and have been for so long, that I think it's the combined effort of so many people looking at it in different ways with different backgrounds, different levels of expertise, whether they're in academia or the public, private sector. Even futurists, hedge fund managers, investment firms are all really trying to look toward the future and understand what's going on. And many recognize that the UFO phenomenon, the UFO phenomenon may be our future. And they're trying to get some insights into what that might be and even ways to capitalize on it. But I really think if you just look across the literature, there's maybe people that wrote books 70 years ago about this, or that are writing them now that we don't yet know about. Or I just don't think there's any one individual or even a way to conceptualize it in the context of one individual. I think it really is just all of us trying to put whatever piece of the puzzle we can together. But there's a lot of people standing around that table working on the same puzzle. Well, I think the main thing for me, and sort of why I got into this, is the morphology and the evolutionary changes that have taken place throughout our past. The hominin past goes back about 6 to 8 million years ago, and throughout that time, the most dominant trends have been an increase in our cranial capacity. We've had our neurocranium get wider and our brain come out over top of our eyes. And in association with that, our mid and lower facial anatomy has retracted and gotten out of the way. So we have this exchange between our brains and our faces. And really, that alone is what drew me into this question, because what is most commonly described are these big, bulbous headed, very small face with almost vestigial noses and mouths. These individuals that have characteristics that are so indicative of hominins, but that same long-term evolutionary trend just continuing into the future. So I think if we just step back and look at our own past ourselves and what we may expect to see in the future, there's a lot of correlates with what people describe with regard to these visitors and the craft they use to, what I would argue, travel through time.